Welcome, everyone. Thank you for watching our set to our parents with love, and welcome to our Q&A with the filmmakers. It's my pleasure to welcome our panelists here today. Melanie Đặng Hồ, director and producer of Mẹ Con, My Mom. Vũ Hoàng, director and writer of Newspapers. Long Le, director, writer, producer of One Summer Night. Kathy Ngo, director, writer, producer of Coconut. Justin Hong Nguyen, director and writer of Lifeline. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. So I just want to begin by asking a general question to you all. All of the shorts address the weight of familial expectations. And I was just wondering, how did you navigate that tension between personal desires and the sense of duty towards parents in your storytelling?
I can go first. So in my film year, the main character, the daughter, her personal desire was to fulfill her sense of duty to her father. And the tension lied in the fact that there was a mismatch between what she thought her father needed or wanted and what he actually needed from her. And this isn't her fault, but he probably, told her growing up, to go to school and be financially stable and, maybe get a nice car and be able to afford traveling, and so those are the things she thought he needed. But by the end of the film, she realizes those aren't things that he needed, and that he probably said those things because it would mean that she would be well and she would be safe. But that wasn't what he needed from her to feel loved. And so, yeah, that was the tension in my film, and it's resolved by the end. But the tension was between her desire and what it was between, what she thought he needed and what he actually needed. So, yeah.
Very similarly, in One Summer Night, Hui and Hai, they both represent these like values of traditional Vietnamese duties and then their own personal goals. And it's that difference between, what do I need to do for my father versus what do I need to do for myself? And it's ultimately due to both of their strong holds on their own values that they end up losing them once Ba passes away in the film. And they ultimately have to find that balance of Vietnamese duties and familial duties and their own personal goals with each other.
I can go next. So my film Newspapers is actually set in the early 90s and the 2000s, and it's really about like assimilating to America. And I think when back then assimilating to America kind of meant like, when you're coming to America, you're as a Vietnamese, you kind of lose when you're growing up. You kind of lose your sense of identity because you're not sure if you're Vietnamese. You're not sure what it's like to be American. And I think when you're growing up, you're trying to find your identity, and you kind of get lost, and you're also not realizing that your parents probably have a harder time assimilating to America than you are. And I think at the end, and our character, or the main character Ben, he sees how hard his mom works because he delivers newspapers with her, but at the same time, he doesn't understand like the struggles that she has until he gets a bit older, and he kind of has his own experiences.
Yeah, I was actually going to hop off that because I thought it was really interesting, talking about how parents like have their own sense of duty that they've and their own goals, that personal desires that they had in their time and based on their situation and where they come from. I think in my film, in Lifeline, the main character has kind of achieved his personal desires. He's like a very successful musician, but despite all that, he comes home and he's confronted with the death of his grandmother and what his leaving has meant to his family. And I think a big element of the film is that he has a conversation with his father where he kind of realizes that his sense of duty was something completely different towards his parents than what our main character has. I think as generations go on, their sacrifices lead to our further goals, and then our sacrifices will eventually lead to our children's goals. And I think continuing that tension is really interesting to me, cross-generationally.
And I think bouncing off the generational aspect of this conversation, my film covers both my mom. It's a documentary about my mom, but also about her mom, so my grandma. And I was thinking about like their tensions and what their desires would be. And I don't necessarily know about my grandma because she passed, but I can feel it from my mom and understand what her own personal desires were. And I think for me, the duty of telling this story is through maybe the name of this Q&A or this group of films, it's with love. Like as a storyteller, I feel like to tell my mom's story and then her mom's story is through love. And so it's the tension of making sure that that's honorable in that way, that I'm telling it in a loving way.
Yeah, thank you all for that. That was definitely something that was so strong throughout all of the shorts, was that, you know, you're navigating this tension, but underneath it all is this deep, profound love, right? And so going off of that, and thinking about different stereotypes and tropes in our community and how you've been working against this, I want to turn to you, Long, because one of the things I found so provocative in the film is how it plays with these, you know, traditional tropes of the oldest child takes on the responsibilities of the family, and you know, the oldest child has to sacrifice his own personal desires, and it's the youngest one, right? The youngest one, so lucky, so rebellious. The youngest is the one who focuses on his own desires and then runs away. But then in the end, what was so provocative was that in the end, the oldest leaves for his new job and the youngest stays behind to tend to his parents' garden, right? And so there's this inversion that happens of these tropes. Can you talk a little bit more about these character arcs and how you complicated them there?
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, these characters in the beginning, they represent those values and tropes, and the oldest child, you know, wants to make those sacrifices for the family, while the younger one wants to pursue his dreams and everything. But it's ultimately when they hit that breaking point, when they realize, like, what are we going to do when Bad dies? Because it's just so imminent and it's something that's looming over them now. They realize that they can't keep on living their lives this way, and by continuing that, it ultimately results in their burnout and their like poor mental and physical health. So ultimately, there's something that needs to change that they realize along the way, by seeing, you know, their dad and the sacrifices that their dad has made for them. And so ultimately, I think they come to realize that they need to do better for not only themselves, but also each other, kind of keeping each other in check and being like, hey, like, you got to stop doing these things that are hurting you. You know, in the way that Hui or Hai comes up to Hui and is like, hey, you're smoking, like, that's destroying you and you don't even realize it yet. Right.
Yeah. And going back to that theme of love as well, it's the love between the brothers, not just for their bad, but also for them, for each other, and looking out for each other, and then navigating. What about self-love there too, right? How do you place yourself in this in this narrative of love? With the going off of the dynamics of the brothers and the father, what I found so interesting was that there were these two instances in the short where the father speaks to each son, but his words are either left untranslated, like it was for Hai. I think it was in the caption said, "Father speaks Vietnamese," right? And then, or it was unheard, right, for Hui. And as the dad is talking to Hai, and we, the audience, don't even get to hear what the dad says. And then you know at the end that Hai probably lied to Hui. And so it's untranslated, unheard for the characters and for the audience. There seems to be these layers of keeping certain information for the family, and then also a play on what information is necessary to share, what is meant to be kept personal. So can you talk about those choices to withhold from the audience, and even from the characters themselves, which I thought was really interesting, and what impact did you hope this would have on the viewers in terms of how they interpret the family dynamics?
Sure, definitely. I think that not only does like misinformation and the lack of information kind of incentivize the viewer to like want to know more and like learn more, but also that Vietnamese families and the language that we speak is really complicated and can be very confusing sometimes. Hi, like myself, as you know, someone who learned Vietnamese very young, but like ultimately assimilated to speaking English. We have like a tougher grasp on especially complex Vietnamese, like things that your family doesn't typically say to you, you know. And so the translation that happens there between hui and hai is so important. It's almost like when you're at like a Vietnamese party and one of your grandmas or aunties comes up to you and like says something to you, but you don't quite understand, so you need your brother to translate that for you. And you're like, hey, like what did she say? And then you reply with something like kind of simple, polite. But ultimately, that's kind of what's going on here. Is Hai is searching for this validation that could have come from Ba, but ultimately comes from Hui. When at the very end of the movie, Hui tells him that Ba said that he was proud of him, and I think Hai kind of knows that he's being lied to or that something is up, but he ultimately takes it because it's an act of love. It's an act of kindness from his brother that isn't always shown between Vietnamese families.
Yeah, I thought that was really a great way to show that dynamic happening live. I think it resonates for so many of us. Continuing on this theme of the dynamics between father and son, Justin, let's turn to you to talk about Lifeline. There's one specific scene that I want to touch on, and you just talked about earlier in the opening question. It's a scene between the musician and his father, right? I thought that was simultaneously so powerful and so painful to see this contrast between the musician's pursuit of his dream and then his father's view of fulfilling family obligations as his dream, right? Can you share how you explored those conflicting ideas of success and responsibility in the film?
Yeah, like I had mentioned, I think something that has grown on me just as I've grown up, and like I've had more conversations with my father and my mom, and I've seen them kind of in a different light than when I was young, is that they have had their own obviously very difficult journey of immigrating here and finding their own success, and within that have had a very different set of goals. Like my dad's dream growing up was always to make sure that we were all fed, because he wasn't always all fed. And I've been lucky enough that because of his goal and because of his obligation being that to do that, that now I was able to be fed, and now I could have my own set of dreams, which is pursuing this and being able to tell these stories about my parents, about my culture. And I think similar to the character, he's lucky enough that as a product of his father, he can pursue this and has, I think, like all of us here have probably had a conversation or of some sort with somebody in our family or our lives about doing what we do, and it's not always the easiest conversation, but I think that success comes from our desire to support them and our desire to make them proud. And I think that's a big thing that Keone has done, and that I've been trying to do more for myself as I've grown up, and make it known so that I can have a more better understanding of who they are, my parents are, but also a better understanding of them for me. So
yeah, and I think one of the things that the film really explores too is like, then what are the costs, right, behind these pursuits of dreams? Both personal costs in the sense of for the son, right? He regrets not being around during his grandmother's last few years, and that is at the cost of pursuing his personal dreams, right? Is the cost is that precious family time that could be so fleeting. At the same time, you kind of touched on, for the father, the personal cost to him of having that dream be, okay, my family is full. My family can eat. My family doesn't have to worry about basic needs, right? The cost for him is then he couldn't think outside of just basic survival. Right? So how do you hope that this element of the cost of pursuing these different types of dreams, how do you hope that resonates with audiences balancing similar struggles?
Yeah, I guess selfishly, the film came out of a very similar situation that I've experienced. Like my first day of grad school at USC was also my grandma's funeral, and so I went straight from my funeral, wasn't there in time for the burial. I had to hop on a plane, brought my duffel bag to class, and it was such a dichotomy of like pursuing one's passions and dreams, which I'm sure my grandma and my family want me to do, but also feeling that selfishness, or also just that desire, that balance, the difficulty of balancing like my family and all the things I want to do both, because I'm doing this for them, but I'm also losing out on elements of them. And I think that's a big thing that we see and we explore in the film. And I think if I was able to get something out of it in telling that story, I hope that anybody that's balancing or sharing that similar struggle can see that and be like, at least see another perspective on, at the end of the film, he makes the choice that sometimes you don't always have to go for the desire, and that sometimes there is a sacrifice that can be made that is a whole nother desire that you have in your life. And I hope that helps in some way.
Yeah, and I think that final scene with, the whole family around the bed and in that morning ritual too was really healing. And so now I wanted to expand a little bit more about healing and these different ways of storytelling. Turning to you, Melanie, with Mẹ Gom. There's such a strong focus on storytelling and food there, right? Not just eating and cooking, but also growing food in this film, thinking about nourishment, right? And literally and symbolically there. How do these elements serve as a bridge between past and present? And what role do they play in maintaining that connection between the mother and then her mother?
Yeah, thanks for asking those questions, Kelly. I think food is something that I think a lot of folks begin to understand identity through. And for me, I understood a Vietnamese identity, but I also understood time in a very specific way, because the things that my mom would grow in her garden, so like mướp đắng, bitter melon, and like rau muống, water spinach, like those kind of things are things that I took for granted when I left for college, and I didn't see it anywhere. I was like in New Jersey, and it's just a way for me to understand like she grew those things because she grew up eating those. She would tell me stories about, she would take me in the garden and point to something and be like, oh, so and so, like my mom would make this, and this is like a story that would always tie back to her mom or tie back to her childhood. And so that's how I would understand like the food that was growing in her garden. Even before she would like sow it and make it into like a meal that I would always consume.
Yeah. Yeah, I especially love this form of storytelling where the mom's telling these stories and it comes in these little bits, right? Because that's kind of how we all experience learning more about our parents, is when we say, they have the hung, right? The inspiration to share. And it tends to be around food that suddenly the hung comes, right? And so it's interesting to see the movements that she does, right? And what she's doing, how she passes time, how she's building up a new home here, but at the same time processing the trauma of leaving. But at the same time that there's that trauma, right? What I found so beautiful in your film was that joy was just emanating from the mother, right? And it was your mom, right?
Yeah.
As she told these stories from her childhood about her mom, right? So we have this, we always talk about intergenerational trauma. I really felt this intergenerational joy from your film. But at the same time that there was that joy, there was this silent sadness, right, from the mother's movements around the garden. And then in that silence, you can really feel the absent presence of her mom that she had to leave behind. So can you talk about how you navigated these dynamics in the film, these feelings of happiness and sadness, presence and absence, and then, like we've been talking to, navigating the conflicting duties, in this instance, conflicting duties of being a mother and a daughter?
Yeah. I'll try to answer this in a way that makes sense. I guess, like, in the process of making this film, I realized that my mom isn't just a mom, she was also a child. And I think that was so touching to me to understand my mom in a different lens. Because I only ever understood her as a mom, sometimes as a wife, sometimes as like a sister, but more so like the main role that she held in my eyes was as a mom. And the times that she would come and tell me about the stories about her mom, she felt like a child to me. And it was a child that I wanted to get to know and to explore. And so I think those feelings of happiness and sadness come through her stories, like once again, of like telling me about her mom. And I think like growing up, I would hear these stories as I did with like my parents. They would tell me these stories, and I was like, okay, that's nice. But I would never hold on to them until I got a little bit older and I could understand like the weight of those stories and what they meant, to understand them as like full humans. And so in a way, like, these are the ways that I can access her emotions, because I know how to access emotions through like creative writing, for example, or therapy. And both of those things like are unknown to my parents. Like, they don't speak English, so they wouldn't be able to read my creative writing, even though a lot of my creative writing is about our family dynamics and me like unpacking it and exploring like trauma and emotions and feelings. But through these conversations within the film, that's how, like, the way that she touches her plants, the way that she cares for them, like even her hand in soil, like through the process of constantly observing that and seeing that, that's how I was able to understand, like, okay, this is what happiness and sadness looks like. This is what's present. What's absent is my grandma, but in a way, I still see like my grandma's ghosts in the garden, in the way that my mom interacts with the plants and what she grows.
Yeah, yeah. You definitely that definitely came through, like both this absent presence, but then an abundance, right, in that garden as well. Has your mom seen the film?
Yeah,
What
we
is
watched it together and she cried. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Oh, so healing. This is to throw this question to all of you. Have your families seen your shorts?
Yes.
Yes.
What do you think,
I
Justin, especially for you, since that was something that was so such a big moment in your life?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It was one of the first times I've shared something with my parents too, because I think a lot of the work I make isn't always about like Vietnamese diaspora and like culturally they would understand. And I think this was one of the first times they were able to see what I've been learning and what I'm passionate about, and they were also really proud. And like when they found out about the Viet Film Fest, they were like, "Oh my gosh!" I was really proud to be able to share something that they could see, and for my dad to see kind of his mom again in a certain way, it's really really healing for him. So
to piggyback on Justin, I also like my parents. I've been doing film for a while, but my parents don't really know everything that I do also. So this is also like the first time I kind of dabbed into like doing something more bit centric, and it is loosely inspired by my childhood and my parents, because they used to pass around newspapers. So I had to throw a screening. I put it in a theater, like they had to see it in a much better capacity than just like at home where they're just singing karaoke and it's too loud to hear anything. It had to be like they had to pay attention type of thing.
Yeah, my mom saw my film and I asked her how it was, and she said it was okay. I do know she cried because I asked her if she cried. She said she did. The one comment was that it was shorter than she expected because she saw how long it took me working on this, and we filmed it in our home, so she saw the chaos, and then it came to 8 minutes and something. She's like, oh, that was I don't know if she expected a feature or something, but
Oh.
Next time, Mom.
I feel like everyone always expects the future when they don't know what those are.
Yeah, my family's reaction was very similar. Whereas like I showed it to my mom and my siblings, and my mom was just kind of like, "Oh, that was it? Like you did all that work and that was it?" And she was like, "Yeah." She was just like, "Oh, you guys like raised so much money, and that's like all you got." And I was like, "Yeah, this is expensive."
Yeah, they don't get it,
but
man.
They don't get it.
They don't get it.
But my siblings are very, very gracious. They cried during it, and they were like, "Well, Long, like so happy to like see you pursuing something that you love," and that was really healing.
Honestly, I cried watching all of your shorts. So it was just like 75 minutes of me just on and off crying and then texting my mom. um, so yeah, so thank you all for I think this is the beautiful thing of having the arts, right? It's healing both for the ones making it, creating it, but also for the people who are engaging with it. I think like watching it and in seeing the different films and dialogue with each other, I think that also helped me think about some of the issues that I've been trying to either work through or suppress or haven't thought about in certain ways. And so it really highlights some of the things that you either try to bury that's deep in the soil, right? And then you need to just put some sunshine, a little water, and let it sprout, right? So going off of this food theme again, let's turn to you, Kathy, with you, the coconut. Represents such a simple and yet such a profound desire in the film. Can you talk about that symbolism behind the coconut and its connection to the father-daughter relationship?
Yeah, for sure. I think I've kind of taken on coconuts as like my whole personality trait since I made this film. The coconut represented a couple of things in the film. Firstly, it represented the homeland, Vietnam. My dad always loved coconut water, sugarcane juice, and I think that was his way of sharing a bit of himself. Making sure that I knew how refreshing these things were because they were to him growing up. And then the second thing that the coconut represented was definitely just love. We talk about Vietnamese parents and Asian parents in general and not expressing their love verbally. And the plate of fruit, they bring the plate of fruit. And so my dad growing up always chopped the coconuts in our household. And then this film is very much based on a true memory of him and myself. So in the film, the daughter, when she gets to try to chop a coconut for him for the first time in her life, it's her way of returning that love. And she struggles with it for a little bit. And because she just feels immense pressure to be able to do this for him. But eventually, I guess you saw in the film, she realizes that it's like the process of chopping the coconut that's important. And she realizes that, and I don't want to spoil it. I guess you've seen the film, but she's able to chop the coconut. But that's not the important part. If she wasn't able to chop the coconut, it would have been okay. But yeah, that's what it represented, just the Vietnamese part of herself and her dad, and then just the love and giving back.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was also so much joy at the same time. You see the dad is, really struggling, but there's the joking that happens between them. I think it's just so beautiful. It reminds me a lot of my dad too, but they kind of like just have to poke at you. And so there's that, like, you see her trying so hard to make him happy, trying so hard to make his suffering just alleviate a little bit. And at the same time, realizing that all he wanted was just like these little moments of joking with her and spending time with her. So I'm also curious about that dialogue between the daughters present and future selves, because I found that also really interesting, right? So often we talk about, oh, ancestors tell us what to do, right? And this is kind of like the inverse of that as well, because it's the future self that is offering this reassurance, right, about the inevitability of loss. Although when you're watching it, you're like, oh, he's gonna be fine. Like, Coconut healed him. Like, what can't Coconut do, right? So why did you choose to include this interaction? Like, why do you think it helps to frame this concept of healing after loss?
Yeah. First, I just want to comment on your first comment. I just want to say thank you for recognizing the humor and the lightheartedness. Even though most people cry from the film, I really wanted it to be a happy film. Like, they're happy tears, they're happy moments. So thanks for acknowledging that. I'm really happy you said that. So like I said, the film is based on a real memory from 7 years ago. And when I was writing the script, I just remembered what it was like at that time. Like, when I was caring for him, and he was much more ill than he was in the film. I didn't really want to depict that. I didn't think it was important for the message either. So, but yeah, my real self 7 years ago was very distraught, very, very lonely, very scared. And when I was thinking about that and trying to write the script, I just wanted to give myself a hug. I just wanted to say, hey, you know what? 7 years later, it's fine. And who better than to tell that person that than myself? And it's my film. I can do whatever I want. So I wrote that in there. Originally, in an earlier draft, it was a bit more campy. It was like the interaction was two ways, but I thought it was a little too cheesy. So I decided to ground it in the altar and make it more spiritual, a little magical, you know, a little more subtle. So that's why I wanted to include the interaction. Yeah. I'm also an only child, so having no siblings and having no one else to kind of tell myself that, I think that also was symbolic. You know, there's a lot of pressure on only children and being Asian. So yeah, that's
Yeah, and you know what I really love with that, the altar scene and how you played with that too, is like you did kind of what Melanie was doing with playing with time, right? And because you at the same time that she's at the altar talking to her dad and updating him, like, I know how to pick a coconut now. Don't worry, they're young, they're fresh. But then she's also then talking to herself in the past to reassure, right? So there's this playing with time and not thinking of time as so linear, but thinking about it in this more cyclical kind of way, right? And it's so interesting in how that connects, you know, both that playing with time and the mixing of joy as well as grief, like Melanie did, right? And I think the two films kind of speak to each other in a really, really great way. Well, thank you for that, Kathy. On to our last panelist. So, Vu, talking about your short newspapers, what I noticed being a millennial, a peak millennial, if you will, was that the technology in the short, right? There's a tiny phone with buttons. Okay, I don't even know where you found that. I think it's a Nokia, if memory serves me. There's a landline, right? And it seems like the film is set in the 90s, early 2000s, right? And this was a time, like I mentioned, I came of age. And so I thought this time period made a lot of sense for the plot, especially how the son gets involved with the wrong crowd. Can you explain a little bit why you chose this time as a setting? You know, especially how it pertains to our community.
I think so. I chose this time because that's where I grew up, and the film is loosely inspired by people around me, like my sister's generation, which is a little older. But it's Vietnamese gangs, and like was way more prevalent, I feel like, in the 90s and the 2000s than it is now. And I think it would if I were to make a film now about Vietnamese gangs, it wouldn't really make as much sense. I feel like it's better because back then, like I think in the late 80s and early 90s, I think it was like one of the highest numbers of Vietnamese immigrants coming to America. And a lot of times when like I think how gangs form, or sometimes when people join gangs, we're trying to find, or like they're trying to find families outside their own families. Because like I think even with my own parents or even my friends or like my siblings, like our parents are so busy like working and trying to assimilate to America. We're also assimilating to America. And I think back then, like I got picked on a lot by other cultures, other races, and like even being picked on for being Vietnamese. And then I think a lot of times what happens is you kind of like find your own, like see other Vietnamese people, you automatically connect with them. But a lot of times I think when the gangs kind of form, even though it's like a brotherhood or a sisterhood, they kind of has a life of its own. And I think the film itself is not really about gangs. It's really about our main character Ben. Is just he grew up here, and he's a good kid, but he kind of just lost his way in the sense of like, because of all the pressures of like assimilating and just Vietnamese American cultures. Like we're almost, there's like being Vietnamese and there's being American, but being Vietnamese American is almost like its own thing also. And I think he kind of struggles with that, and it kind of leads to these decisions that he makes in the film that, you know, ultimately isn't the best. But it needs to be set in the 90s and the 2000s, because I want it to be authentic. Like even finding a young version of the main character Ben that speaks Vietnamese now, he's like 11-year-old kid. It's like impossible to find. Like we auditioned so many kids. They can either speak Vietnamese and can't they're not actors, or they either can't speak Vietnamese. And then my team was like, why don't you just add English to it? And I was like, there's no way. Nobody back, even I spoke Vietnamese back. I'm not very fluent in Vietnamese anymore, but even I spoke Vietnamese back then. It just made no sense. So even though this is not part of the question, but we found my friend had a little brother who actually sings in Vietnamese in NorCal. He does skits. So he's like on stage. He's never acted before. And then I was like, dude, where was he this whole time? We were looking for this kid for like weeks. And then I flew back to NorCal before my Vietnam trip, and I auditioned him and we booked him. But we needed that authenticity, in my opinion, especially when you do a period piece. It matters a lot. Like, you know, every poster, every just even the car we found, like a 1980s like Honda Civic. I don't know how our production designer, shout out to Matt Vo for that, but yeah, just things like that matter. Like period pieces, everything needs to kind of come together. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that floored me about this short, was just the attention to detail, so that you can really immerse yourself in the setting and the time period. And like I said, having grown up in that period, it just felt very real. And you know, because of that feeling, the setting is so real that then the pain and what the characters are going through also feels so visceral, right? And you know, I want to go off of what you were talking about with being Vietnamese American is its own thing, being Vietnamese and then being American. And this kind of gets juxtaposed in the back and forth scenes between the son dying in the alleyway and then the mother making pho, right? There's something so devastating about this back and forth that you see. So you have, on the one hand, the mom is preparing the quintessential Vietnamese comfort food, right? And it's nourishing the mind, the body, the soul. And then on the other hand, it's like you see the fatal consequences in real time of the son's strong sense of responsibility to his family. And I think that's what's so devastating. It's like he got off on this wrong path, but then it began from the sincere desire to care for the family. So can you talk about your decision behind contrasting these two scenes?
I think when I first wrote the script, we didn't have the flashbacks in there. It was really just like a last phone call to his mother. That was really just like a phone call. But then when I was writing it, I realized like there wasn't enough of showing like the Vietnamese immigrant experience. So that's when I decided to add in like the newspapers, like because the newspapers, passing on newspapers, I think a lot of like Vietnamese back then probably knew about that, because I think I've heard from many that after I wrote the script and I showed the film that, you know, their parents passed on newspapers. It was just kind of easy way for us to, you know, survive. Yeah. So it's just like, you know, it's surviving and our parents are just surviving. And then when he's making that last call, I think he starts to realize like something's wrong with him. And there's a lot of shame and guilt in his phone conversation. And he at the same time, if he feels that he's starting to like lose it a little bit. So he was trying to just share like his last happy memory, which is like back when he's passing on newspaper with his mom when he was really young and innocent. Because I usually think back, you know, when things happen to me or when I feel depressed or anything, I think back like when I was a kid, everything was so carefree. You know, everything just felt so nice, and like you didn't know too much about the world. but you're just so happy, right? And that was his memory back then. So I think the flashback scene was more about like when he's actually starting to come out in and out consciousness and hearing his mom's voice for the last time. It triggered these memories of like when he was most happy. It was when he used to pass around newspapers with his mom. So then I kind of, and also with food, like your mom makes pho or like whatever it is in Vietnamese culture, even Asian culture in general, there's just this comforting feeling you get when you kind of like your mom makes you food and you're sitting at the table, or maybe you're with your whole family and eating. And I think because in the film he kind of makes a promise that he wants to take care of his mom. So in the flashbacks, it kind of raises guilt a little bit, because like he, in a way, he provides, because he does like call her and tell her where like the money he has, and in a sense he feels like he did provide for the family in the best way that he knew he could. And since he didn't do it in the best way, but I think, he felt he did what he could with the cards that he was dealt. And then the flashback kind of just adds this whole like, it's really just his mom's voice triggering these happy memories as he kind of goes away, in a sense. But it's not fully, I mean, I'm planning to make this a feature, so there's like more to everything, but that's based on the short. That's kind of like how the flashbacks work.
Yeah, it kind of leaves you hanging. I was just like, does he make it? Does he just tell her where you are? Yeah, and I was just like, oh, she doesn't even have a GPS tracker. She can't even figure out find my phone.
Yeah, she got a pager, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, that was, I just thought the flashbacks and were so, it added so much. So I'm really glad you added that. I thought it added so much to the film. And the actor that you found to play that 11-year-old was also just so great at, I guess, portraying that like innocence, right? When you first come over and you're a kid and you don't realize like this was backbreaking, grueling work, and he hasn't yet come to terms with issues like assimilation, right? And so you see that innocence being juxtaposed with what you don't even see in between of what he's had to deal with, but you only see the consequences in the aftermath of that. And I think it's also like, what we were talking about with the other shorts of what is left unsaid that is just so powerful.
Yep.
Well, we're coming up to the end of our session, and so I just want to have one last closing general question for you all. And that's, how has creating your film shaped or changed your own perspective on the relationship between children and parents, especially regarding familial duty and personal fulfillment, which is so important, such an important theme to all of your films?
I'll take this one first. So I've already talked about how I now see my mom as like taking on a role of a child and like what that means to me being a child. I'm also the youngest child. So I think I have observed a lot of responsibilities, but I've also gotten away with a lot. So I feel very fortunate to my oldest sister. But I think like in a way, I don't know if like, I think there's maybe a feeling of wanting the family to live on in a way. And like sometimes that's seen in a very traditional sense of like having children, for example. But for me, the way that I see as a storyteller is that I'm listening to my parents, like I'm listening to their stories, and I'm archiving them in a very specific way through documentary film. And so for me, that's how I feel like I'm fulfilling a familial duty, and it becomes a personal duty of I'm paying attention to my ancestors and I'm having a conversation with them in a way.
I can go next. I think the purpose of when I've been trying to make a Vietnamese like centric film for like years. Nothing really connected with me until I started getting more personal. Because I was talking about how like Vietnamese American, like I was like, oh, I'm not Vietnamese enough to make a Vietnamese film. I'm more like more Americanized now. But at the same time, I started realizing like what Vietnamese American is. But then making a film like this, that's kind of like obviously inspired by my mom and just my parents and my family. It got me a little closer in terms of like how of my own like how I feel about being Vietnamese in my own way. And then it got me to talk, because I did interviews, like I talked to like my siblings friends, family members, and I asked about their stories more. So I think it brought me closer to my family in general in terms of like their story, instead of me just kind of scared of it at the beginning. But me taking on this film, authenticity mattered, like I mentioned, and to do that, I have to talk to them. I have to I need to understand things more on the level that I didn't understand before. And when I was younger, I didn't get it, but as I got older, I started to realize like how important it is for me to understand. And I decided, since film is my passion, that I do it through film. And I think that's kind of like, this is kind of just the beginning for me. But I think it was a great decision for me to take this on, for not just to make a film, but also just for like my own personal growth, culturally and as a person.
Yeah, kind of similarly to Vu, I also like talk to a lot of my family members about what the experience of like putting my father into the hospice care was like. And so I sat on like hours long calls with people and just like hashed through like, what did you feel? What was the experience like for you? How did you guys come up? Like, what did you guys talk about? And ultimately it changed the course of the entire film and in the early stages of writing it. And so it definitely brought me a lot closer to my siblings and my family, just understanding their perspective. And in a very interesting way, like I had initially made this film for myself as like a way to tell my story, as a way to further advance my career as a filmmaker, get into festivals and stuff. But along the way, what I learned was like, I mean, the journey is just such a great part of it. And I loved working with all the people that I worked with. And ultimately, I think this film, no matter how many festivals it gets into, no matter like how well it does with people, I think it's ultimately for the people that I worked with. It's for my family. And like, that's what this film is for me, or for those people, not for me. You know what I mean?
Everyone.
I think to quickly piggyback on that long, I also agree, because I think when I made this film, part of the reason was also to kind of meet more Vietnamese filmmakers and actors. Because before, I felt like a little bit of an outcast in terms of like I wasn't sure who to turn to, where to go, because I've done film on a different scale, like outside of the community, and I didn't know who was in the community, who wasn't. But once I made this film, like I feel like now I've met like so many people, like on my projects, even Long on his projects. Like we've met before we started doing our projects, and it kind of just like it kind of just brought us all together. Even right now, VFF in general, before just this Q&A alone, and obviously when that event happens, we're probably gonna run into each other at the same time too. So I think a lot came out of it, aside from what we just talked about too. Oh, you're muted, Justin.
It's okay. We'll cut this. We'll cut this.
Should I just go next while you fix that? We'll cut
Yeah.
this part. Okay. Let me act natural, sir. Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I agree. This whole experience has been, making this film has been really, really rewarding. I didn't study film. Also, I'm from Canada. I don't know if anyone else in this is from Canada, but I've met so many Vietnamese people in film and in art as well, and it's been super inspirational. For me, making the film, I kind of felt bad for my mom because I just wrote her out of the memory. It's just completely about my dad and my love for my dad. But my relationship with her has definitely changed since making the film, but also since my dad's passing. I just realized that it's more the day-to-day interactions that really show that you love someone and that you're present in that relationship. It's not the bigger gestures or the materialistic, gifts, or like the ways of giving back that are more materialistic. So, it's when I try to learn a recipe of hers, or like I just bring home a treat, even though I've been out all evening. It's things like that that have really changed my relationship with her. But in general, I made the film because my dad passing, my view of grief has really changed in a positive way. Like when I think about my dad now, it's really happy thoughts and a happy feeling. In my film, when that line, like, dad is still here, even though he's not physically there anymore, he's there in spirit. Like, he's there because she's going to love coconut water for the rest of her life. And he's there because she's funny. She got her sense of humor from him, you know? So day to day, like when I observe my mom and when I interact with her, I notice the ways that, like, her habits that I picked up that will live on with me forever. So I mean, she's alive and well, you know, but one day when that day comes, you know, it's those things I'll remember, and she'll always be there. And the film, I want anyone who's grieving to remember that, or anyone who's like worried about their parents passing or whatever it is, a friend, you know, a dog, like, these beings leave their imprints on us, and that lives with us forever. So that's why it's a happy film. So yeah,
Yeah, I wanted to jump off of everybody's statement about their ability to connect with the industry here now. I think I came out of undergrad in New York, so I was working in that space, and there really wasn't a Vietnamese community there, filmmakers. And now in LA, it's with this project and being able to meet everybody. The mom in my film is the mom in Abu's film, which is so interesting. And
Cat.
yeah, we love Kat. she's in so many films.
Dude, you're like in like half the films here. Here, but in the festival.
But I think it's so cool that she kind of is like become an auntie to me too now, and like I'm sure with many other people, and how connected people become to the projects. And I think something that was really interesting was when I was sharing the project with people, of course, within the Vietnamese community, they're very appreciative and see it, but even beyond that, like from other cultures that see it, and different races that still connect with the stories we tell because of how specific we tell it. I think that shows that there's a space for what we do beyond just what we do. Like, of course, we want to make it here, but we want to be able to show these stories to people outside, to let them understand our cultures. And I think that's what we're all doing here. And I hope that's what we continue to do, and like with Vu's feature, and get it out there, and get more people to see the stories that we've lived, because they deserve to be heard. And I think that's this film has helped me feel that much more.
Wow. Well, thank you all on that note of, building this collective, this community of storytellers, right? Not just storytellers, but also, in a sense, you're working as these healers, right? And helping others kind of work through, different issues of like intergenerational tensions, for example, working through issues of responsibilities and duties and the different roles that we take on, but also the different roles that our parents take on that sometimes we forget when we just think of them as bao, as man, right? And so thank you all for reminding us that we all can contain multitudes, and that collectively all of our voices can come together and create not only these narratives that we've heard, but also these counter narratives of what other folks may think of when they think about our community, or what we want future generations to also think about when we're thinking about the past, present, and future Vietnamese American history, right, and experiences. So thank you all. And that's all the time we have for today, but thank you for being with us. And I hope you at home or in the theaters have enjoyed our Q&A with our filmmakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.